Carolyn?
Hello, everybody. Hi, Marjory Bancroft is here with us. Hello, everybody who's attending. Thank you for being here today. This is a really exciting opportunity to have Marjory here presenting on this very unique and very worthwhile topic of self-care for remote interpreters. This is our first webinar back in 2020. So a happy new year to everybody and welcome and thank you again for joining us. So I'll let Marjory take it away. She is the Director of Cross-Cultural Communications, and she is an expert in this topic. She's going to be presenting to us. We will also have a poll that I will announce shortly.
Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, wherever you happen to be. I am Marjory Bancroft. As Carol just explained, I will be the presenter today because this is not only the topic about which I'm most passionate in all the field of interpreting, but I become kind of the accidental national point person on this topic. However, Carolyn is really a specialist in her own right in many aspects of self-care, but also in remote interpreting. And just FYI, I have invited her to pop in at any time with comments as she sees fit based on her observations and experience. But at any rate, welcome to this webinar. My intention is to speak for about 45, 50 minutes of the hour and then open things up to questions. If you want to type questions in chat or questions as we go along, Carolyn will be monitoring so that she can relay them to me later. What we are going to talk about is very simple. We're going to talk about Marjory, there we go, having difficulty with buttons. No, learning objectives for this webinar are pretty straightforward. The fact of the matter is, I am hearing from interpreters in general, but remote interpreters in particular, what's going on in the field. And there's a lot of unrecognized stress and vicarious trauma going on. To give you a bit of background before I even introduce these learning objectives you see here, why am I so crazy about this topic? The fact of the matter is, that I have always had a personal interest and years of volunteering on behalf of trauma survivors. I've spent years with a volunteering for a sexual assault center in my local county in Maryland, and as a hotline counselor, as a hospital advocate, for fundraisers, anything they wanted me to do, I did. I spent 2 years on emergency backup for a national crisis hotline and a youth crisis hotline that was actually located in a homeless shelter. And I spent 6 years on the board of a local, basically a torture treatment center. In other words, a center that provided therapy and resources and even legal assistance for asylum seekers and refugees. And so that was how, in the meantime, I'm having, this professional career after having lived in 8 countries around the world and traveled through many others in interpreting and then providing services to immigrants and refugees from around the world while interpreting and seeing kind of a lot of things on the ground, but not connecting all those dots until when I first joined the board of the torture treatment nonprofit. I learned to my horror, after I had now been many years running this only national training agency for community interpreting. It's called Cross-Cultural Communications, as you heard Carolyn say. And I learned to my horror that they were having volunteer interpreters for refugees and torture survivors. And I'm going, no, you need trained professional interpreters. First of all your volunteers can come to all our trainings for free. And secondly, I will volunteer to give a one-day training to your volunteer interpreters. And I had been giving interpreter training by then for many, many years. I mean, we have trainers all across the country, but I was still a very active trainer. And I thought, I can do this in my sleep. This is just a one-day intro. This is nothing. We do 5-day training, 6-day training. I mean, this is a piece of cake. I walked into that training and almost from the start, I got questions from these interpreters for refugees and asylum seekers and torture survivors that I'd never heard before. And I will never forget, and this is mental health, but this happens for remote interpreters who are doing more and more mental health interpreting. So something like this could happen to you. The interpreter puts up her hand and she says, Marjory, what do you do when the client is crying and the therapist is crying and you're crying? And I just looked at her and it's like, I had no idea what to say. And at that time, I was already a national famous trainer in my field. So I went back to the executive director and I said, of this torture treatment center, and I said, listen, if I don't know the answers to these questions that these interpreters from major trauma survivors are coming out with, then I would say most interpreter trainers do not have the answers to these questions. We need to start creating special training. And that was many, many years ago. And we've created, 1 day and half day and 5-day trainings and all kinds of trainings. I'm sorry, I didn't need to jump ahead. About how do you interpret for trauma survivors. In the process, we did a lot of needs assessment. And whether you are a face-to-face interpreter, telephone interpreter, video interpreter, what we're hearing is a lot of vicarious trauma that people are not even recognizing that they maybe have, but they're dealing with it as interpreters. So what this webinar is about is to show you, by defining stress versus trauma, what trauma is, what some of the things that happen to both service providers and interpreters are, like compassion fatigue and burnout, and of course the big one, vicarious trauma. And sorry, I keep doing that. And then, well, what can you do about all this? And there are very simple techniques that you can do to help yourself before, during, and after the interpreted session that we develop for face-to-face training, but most of them apply very well to remote interpreting, as you will see. And then, how do you develop a self-care plan? Because I don't care what country in the world you're in or what part of the United States, since we're in the States, very few interpreters get more than maybe 20 minutes out of, say, a 1-week training on real self-care, with the exception of sign language interpreters, who generally have much better programs and more comprehensive self-care. So that's what we're going to talk about. But right now, Carolyn is going to do a poll for you, because I want to find out from those who are already on the webinar how you feel about interpreting remotely by telephone or video when you're dealing with some of the more extreme cases, whether it's 911 calls or police or healthcare or whatever the situation is. When you're interpreting for banks or something, probably this doesn't come up as much. But how do you feel about interpreting for stories or content that involve abuse or extreme trauma? Carolyn, do you want to take the poll?
Yeah, sure. So here we go. I'm going to launch this poll being distributed. So take the time, people, interpreters who are there on the session, and we will get an idea of what sort of needs are out there in terms of self-care. Marjory, can you see the progress of the poll? You should be able
to. I do not see the progress. You behind the scenes can see that, I know, but I'm just seeing the poll itself.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So if you could report out, that would be great.
Sure, yeah, I'll give it another minute, half a minute, and then I will give you some percentages here. Just want to give everybody the chance to vote here. While people are voting, by the way, Marjory, I wanted to say thank you for sharing your background. I know we're working on stuff together and our work colleagues, but it's always great to hear how people become passionate about this kind of topic. So I appreciate that.
And it's a topic that even interpreters don't hear discussed very much, and people who work with interpreters just don't even think about.
Yeah, exactly. Much less in the remote specific field, which I think a lot of times goes it's not spoken about as much because people think they have this technological barrier between them and the situation or the session.
Like the interpreter is almost just another piece of the technology.
Yeah, kind of, exactly. All right, well, we have a good idea here. So I would say, that the largest percentage is that some sessions hit hard, and then a lot of times most people are fine. So 22% said they're fine, 56% said some sessions hit me hard, while 11% said that it haunts them for weeks or months or years, and then 11% says that it doesn't affect them at all.
This is fairly typical of interpreting for face-to-face. And so what that, at least for those who are on the call, what that shows me is that what we're finding across the country and in other parts of the world is that some interpreters have very strong boundaries, and some interpreters have the very opposite. They have very fluid boundaries, or soft ones, if you will. And so things can penetrate some people, some interpreters more than others. Doesn't involve weakness, has nothing to do with being strong or weak. It's different personality characteristics. That said, even if you're feeling great now, it could be that a certain call hits really close to home because maybe it's about rape and your sister or someone you love very much was raped, or you're a refugee and it's something too similar to something that happened to a member of your family, or to you. Anything can surprise you. So without further ado, we will.
So do you mind if I share a few comments from some of the listeners here that are really interesting? We have an interpreter here from New Zealand, and they're letting me know that a lot of the interpreters working with refugees or in traumatic sessions have access to counseling and to debrief after sessions.
Clapping.
So yeah, I'm clapping as well. That's amazing. I wish we had that more here in the States. And then another comment here, as interpreters, we're supposed to have no feelings and emotions. We are voiced simply. That's why nobody raises the topic, which is a great point. And I think it's if you want to comment on that, I was just going to say that basically, yeah, that's why it's so underlooked. It's not something that they talk about as much in this field because they expect interpreters to not have any emotions whatsoever, which is just false.
It's false, but it's a very real perception. And one of the big purposes for me about doing this webinar is to say, guys, it's okay to have feelings even if other people don't understand that you do. There's nothing wrong with you if you're affected, even if you've never been affected. This is a perception that's out there. It's not everyone who thinks interpreters shouldn't be affected. But I'll tell you a story I was going to tell you later in the webinar. I was giving a training just a year and a half ago for a court, the Minister of Office of the Courts, to court interpreters who, as you know, are expected to be very tough. And we had a great day, and a lot of them had been very traumatized. We did a survey ahead of time, so we knew there was some serious vicarious trauma, and they loved the whole one-day workshop. Everything was possible. But the next day, I gave a training to court staff. What happened during that training of the court staff, which is a one-day training on how to work effectively with interpreters and trauma survivors, was that very early in the day, a prosecuting attorney who was a member, because there were all kinds of different kinds of court staff, even a couple of court reporters, victim compensation clerks, just everybody. And the prosecuting attorney, after I just happened to mention in passing, that court interpreters, like other interpreters, do experience vicarious trauma, something I'll be addressing today, she put up her hand and she lit into me for like 3 solid minutes about how our court interpreters absolutely do not have vicarious trauma. This is, and if they ever did, they shouldn't be court interpreters. And she went on and on and on, just getting steadily more and more angry. And she closed with, and here you are saying that they do have vicarious trauma, and I find that completely ridiculous and absurd. Now, you can imagine, as a professional trainer, I had to calm down the whole class and make them feel safe, because that was a bit of an unsafe environment at that point.
I'm shaking my head over here.
I can imagine. The bottom line was she did that periodically throughout the day, and also had a bad response to some of the exercises where I put them through exercises like interpreting obscenities and graphic content and violent acts to give them a taste for what interpreters have to do every day in the courtroom. And by the end of the day, there were a couple of therapists in the room, and I had conversations with them, and with one of them later on. And then that night, it suddenly hit me that this was a traumatized person who was dealing with it in her own way by just denial and projecting in ways that were honestly tough for interpreters. So this is an extreme case. Most people are not this extreme, but you do need to understand as interpreters that you are worth self-care, that what people believe about you isn't necessarily true, and that you can be a great interpreter and still have some challenges in this field. We'll talk about all kinds of things, specific things you can do, but one of the resources I wanted to alert you to, and you'll be getting a copy of this, or and you can email for us for this resource if you have problems accessing the web link at the bottom, because it's very long. This is a project that my organization and I specifically was involved in leading for a nonprofit in DC, a legal services nonprofit that has both the legal services, a nonprofit legal interpreting service, and a nonprofit victim services interpreting service, both for spoken and sign language. And it's a 300-page training manual on how to perform trauma-informed interpreting for victims of violent crime. There's a workbook of about 100 pages of role plays and exercises, all created with victim services specialists, so really authentic role plays and exercises, and a glossary. And it's free, so this is a great resource, and even though it was created in the US, I think it might be helpful for anyone in the world. And I just mentioned court interpreters because there's this perception that they have to be tougher than everyone, even tougher than you remote interpreters. And here are some of the things that they quote in surveys. What are some of the things they find hardest when they interpret for abuse and other cases involving trauma survivors? Trying to remain neutral and unbiased came up again and again and again and again. And not showing judgmental or accusatory feelings. Well, you on the phone are not going to show that in your body language, but you'd be amazed how much your voices can give you away. And again, here's another one. Remain impartial, almost impossible, yet I have to contain those emotions, someone reports. They also find it hard to maintain a professional demeanor, to show that they're being accurate and unbiased. And also hard, like you want to show that you care about the survivor, and you don't want to show that you feel really angry and this contempt for the abuser. These are real challenges. But I'm having a problem with the control panel, because when I move the control panel, I change so I can see what's on the screen. That's when I go to the next.
No worries.
So other challenges is just sheer emotionally draining. If you're on the call and video, a lot of people don't understand that that's actually harder than face-to-face. And so you get tired, even linguistically tired, much, much sooner. What a lot of people don't understand is when you're trying to maintain your composure, I mean, as hard as that is for these court interpreters, or hold back your tears, when you're on phone or video, you tire out much more quickly. So it's not just that it's harder to be accurate, it's harder to contain your emotions, and your emotional energy drains faster. We're only starting to get the research on this. Most of the research for remote interpreting is actually centered on accuracy, but we're getting a sense of some of the challenges that are involved that people are not recognizing for remote interpreters. So again, these are examples like not getting emotionally involved, feeling sad for days, weeks, or longer. Kind of an anger for the court interpreters when voices of victims are dismissed. That could happen to you on a call. But even worse for the remote interpreters in some ways is then not knowing what happens. At least the court interpreter can find out what happened in a court case. When you're on a call, and you walk away, unless you're doing therapy, it's unlikely that you're ever going to find out what happened to that person. And I say therapy because even for remote interpreters, they might invite you back to have the same interpreter for consistency, but generally that's not happening for other areas. And then that not being able to talk about it afterwards or getting scared, that could happen to remote interpreters. So if this is this hard for the court interpreters, what is it like for you, and why is nobody asking that question? I'm having trouble with the control panel, Carolyn, just so you know.
Okay.
Yeah, in other words, if I touch it, this is just an FYI to Carolyn, not anyone else. So the question is, what makes it different? If you're interpreting traumatic content in remote interpreting, and there is a chat feature, if you would just like to write down, what do you think is different about interpreting traumatic content compared to face-to-face interpreting? So go ahead and do that now. I'll give you a few examples, but you may have other ones that we do want to hear. Well, for one thing, it really helps to be emotionally prepared. Like if you know in advance what you're walking into, that can make a world of difference. Well, remote interpreting, how likely is that to happen? Whether you're in a call center or you're working from home, you're typically diving into call after call and you get briefed, seconds before. That's what we mostly hear. And then if you try to get information beforehand, who would you even do that with? It's not going to happen. And debriefing, we'll talk more about debriefing, but typically that is not happening in a systematic way, even when language companies have counselors on call and they tell me, oh, we let the interpreters know. And I talk to the interpreters and the interpreters don't know that there's counselors available for debriefing. It's news to them. So the fact that you're going from call to call, well, in principle, you're getting breaks, right? And in principle, if it's a really rough call, you could ask for a break. I know one interpreter, he's a friend of mine actually, and he was a court interpreter in Texas, moved to Florida, and while he was looking for a court interpreter position, he jumped in several months to a call center and became a call center interpreter. He's going like, Marjory, yeah, in principle, you can ask for a break, but there's always someone watching. And they're roaming like hawks to make sure that everybody gets back, so there's this pressure on you. You've got to be on the call. And this is not something that people like Carolyn or I can do anything to control. This is your reality, depending on who you interpret for. The other thing is the weirdness. Like 1 minute you could be interpreting for a car accident and then that ends, and the next thing it's, somebody's disputing a bill or there's a problem setting up a bank account. It can go from the mundane to the dramatic back to the mundane, and you're not really trained for the emotional impact of that. In fact, around the world and in this country, in general, remote interpreters are not very well trained at all, and specifically not for remote interpreting. So as Carolyn and I are involved in a project to try and create training for remote interpreting in general. The other thing is that feeling of isolation, which can actually affect face-to-face interpreters, can be even stronger. And more isolating a feeling for remote interpreters. And what Carolyn was referring to earlier, the fact that, oh, you're part of the technology, you're part of the background. It's almost like you're not a human being, but just somebody transfers from one language to another the way machine interpreting might do.
Yeah, and I, if you don't mind, I'm going to share some of the comments here from people. And a lot of it is similar to what you mentioned, but isolation was a huge one. Like you just mentioned, that it's hard to debrief if you're just in your home office, you don't have anybody to talk to afterwards. Right. Another is little time between calls, like you also mentioned, just going from different scenario to different scenario, and some are very intense, some are very mundane. So how do you transition your sort of mental state throughout that process when it's happening so quickly? And then what else? See, looking through the comments here. I mean, this is a big one too. If you're in a situation where it's just an over the phone and you don't see the client, sometimes this can create a sense of alienation because you're missing a lot of the verbal cues, body language, or sorry, not the verbal cues, but the body language, the visual cues. So it leaves you kind of in the dark, which is why VRI is becoming more and more prevalent. Yeah, so a lot of people saying that they feel isolated, that they don't have somebody to talk to, and these remote interpreting language companies don't consider the vicarious trauma that occurs in the U.S. at least typically. We got a lot of comments. Sorry, so making sure we cover everything.
Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, we got people asking for resources, which I'm sure you're going to go over, and trainings. Yeah, okay, great. This is kind of the comments we got so far.
Thank you. Well, and just to show you again, what we're seeing in the field is that contrary to what people say and think, there is a very significant percentage of interpreters who are impacted directly by interpreting. And mental health, that's just happened to be an area of research, but I've seen many other things. And another thing that we're not talking about much is the fact that according to the United Nations, 1 woman in 3 will be raped or abused in her lifetime, and as many as 1 in 5 or 6 men. And remote interpreters are not exceptions to those statistics. And as you will see, the fact of having trauma in your background can affect how you are affected by trauma when it appears in your work. So the question is, well, what is trauma? How would you define it? In the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and give you kind of the horse's mouth in the United States, which would be the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Individual trauma, and this is complex, results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. That's really broad. It's sort of like international definitions of health are broad. So are the good definitions of trauma. And they can affect interpreters in a variety of ways, just as they affect survivors. So anything that happens to a survivor can affect you, especially if you're interpreting directly for a survivor during a call, because the survivor could cry or just, and this makes interpreters so uncomfortable, like there's 2 or 3 minutes of silence. And some service providers will just sit with silence. They're trained to sit with silence. And you, the interpreter, are going absolutely out of your mind. We actually have done research on this, and I co-trained with an interpreter who said, oh, I was one of those interpreters rustling papers, coughing, trying to get the attention of the service providers because what's happening here. So silence is incredibly disorienting for interpreters. Or like someone is talking about rape and they will giggle, and that could be the survivor. I've actually heard about a male interpreter for a female rape survivor giggling, and obviously that was a nervous response. They mumble and then you can't interpret what they say and you don't want to interrupt, but you have to ask them to please repeat what they just said. Or they suddenly blow up and they're really, really angry, and that's disorienting because a minute ago they were so calm or distant. There can be any reaction from a trauma survivor, and that in and of itself is not only disorienting, it can have an impact on you that is not, as I said, being recognized. Well, talk about direct trauma. We'll get to vicarious trauma in just a sec, but this is a question that therapists often ask, and that is, what are the 3 things that are taken away from victims of major trauma? What do you think those 3 things might be? When we ask interpreters that question, we get all kinds of answers, and they're all usually right answers. But
we have a few thrown out here. Control, trust, power.
Yeah, control and power are variations on one of the three. Trust is one of the three. I'm sorry?
Dignity, sorry. Yeah, trust is one of them. Choice.
You're getting
their self-perception. Safety.
Safety. That's number two. And it's been alluded to by others, but in different words. And that is, when you say control or power, those are words that I think a lot of therapists don't want to gravitate to for different reasons. So instead, they're saying things like the ability to impact the world. But ultimately, they are talking about control the ability to control your own part of the world. And that's when that's taken away, it has a terrible impact. And unfortunately, you with the best intentions can perpetuate that even on the phone. You'd be amazed what we hear service providers report, that interpreters are saying comforting words as asides. Okay, this is not coming from the service provider, or things like everything will be all right, and we don't know that everything will be all right, and service provider doesn't want the interpreter to say things like that. Or a therapist or a lawyer might be using harsh language on purpose, and the interpreter will soften it so as not to upset the survivor. Or even on the phone, believe it or not, we've heard about them, not as much on the phone or video, I will say that, but about giving advice. They will actually give advice. And these are not even things they would normally do with other sessions. Getting into more side conversations or explaining things, which is not a good idea. Get the service provider to make the explanations, or the survivor, but don't get involved yourself. Building a relationship with the survivor is actually not a good idea, because they actually need the relationship with whoever the service provider is, or it could harm or even destroy the service provider relationship. So you want to manage your emotions, not just for yourself and your self-care, but also for the survivor's sake. And as for impacting you, again, don't minimize what might happen to you, and try to recognize it, even if you've never been traumatized before. Because I love these words. This is from a therapist I personally know in Maryland, a torture treatment therapist. She said, it's important to note that trauma is subjective, and the threshold is different and unique for each individual. In other words, what one person considers to be traumatic may not be traumatic to someone else. That absolutely includes interpreters. Now, so what's the difference between stress and trauma? Well, basically, stress is a normal part of everyday life. It's just that emotional strain or tension. It comes from the fact that you're dealing with challenges of one kind or another, in not just in your job, any kind of part of your life. And yeah, it can be overwhelming, and yes, it can paralyze us, and in extreme cases, kind of predispose us to vicarious trauma. But at the end of the day, it's just part of everyday life. It can even be beneficial. It can motivate us. We can make changes. It can energize us. There's something called eustress, which is basically the positive kind of stress. But some of that is how we interpret the stress. So we can turn stress into, quote, eustress, happy stress. But I've been confronted so long with the idea that the interpreter is like a black box, where something goes in as language, spoken language or sign language, and comes out as the same message in another language. That I'm going to ask you outright, how is an interpreter like a black box?
It's a great question. What do people in the audience think?
Okay.
Like we are robots, kind of?
Yeah, that's what people think.
Yeah.
People think that interpreting is easy, and they don't understand that interpreters are not black boxes, and they don't understand it even after the interpreter crashes and burns out and leaves the profession of interpreting. Yes, when we started doing needs assessment, we found out that this was really happening. This is a real thing. We fear it might be a bigger thing for remote interpreting if we're not careful, because people think interpreting is easy. Why then does trauma affect interpreters so much? I think I was the first person to figure this out, and I've been using this image in trainings for years and years and years. As far as I know, as far as we know, the interpreter is the only person in the session who is processing any traumatic content at least 4 times. First of all, you're not just doing any listening. You're doing what we call, and what therapists call, active listening. So you really have to absorb the message in a very deep way. So that's one level of processing. But then, do we interpret words? No, we interpret meaning. And so you have to understand and analyze the message to extract the meaning, because that's what you're going to interpret. Then you have to convert the meaning, the message, into an equivalent meaning in the target language. And then you have to dress it up in words. And the words have to reflect the same spirit and intent and tone and register of language. And that's at least 4 levels of processing. And if you were taking notes, as many interpreters do, and you're interpreting off your notes, that is conceivably a 5th level of processing. So there it is, that the person in the room or the call is who is the only person who is cognitively processing the traumatic content at least 4 times is the interpreter. But who is thinking about the interpreter? Everybody forgot, including therapists. I've talked to many therapists who do get it and who offer debriefs and who are wonderful and supportive of interpreters, but most therapists to this day are not really aware of the impact. So if the therapists don't recognize it, who? If stress and trauma may be aggravated by specific things like interpreting for crisis, accidents, and other stressful events, and that is happening in remote interpreting. Anything involving traumatized or abused children, that's almost like the worst thing interpreters say again and again. If you're confronted with terms you've never heard, which happens a lot in remote interpreting, that's stressful, and too much of it, especially in this uncomfortable trauma arena, can lead to overload, especially if it involves obscenities, coarse language, intimate body parts, violent or sexual acts. That can really be cumulative. If you've had a similar trauma yourself or a past trauma that isn't fully resolved, that can affect you. If you're a refugee who has to interpret for the same kinds of problems that you went through in your life for other refugees, probably from the same region, that can be super hard. We hear that one again and again, or just having a lot going on in your life at any given time. It can lead to compassion fatigue. This is something that therapists and social workers and other professionals know well. It's basically professional burnout. And you start losing the capacity to feel, the capacity to care, and it's usually from hearing too much, too many stories of suffering. So you stop caring, it's all too much, you get drained, and that leads to vicarious trauma, which is when you're exposed to so many traumatic stories that they start to affect you. And what are the symptoms? Well, you could have anxiety if you're interpreting certain calls where bad things happen, like too many 911 calls, or intrusive or distressing thoughts. You could get clinical depression. This absolutely happens. There is no shame in getting counseling, interpreters, please. Insomnia is a common one for vicarious trauma. One that surprised me is getting a lot of recurrent health, like infections and viruses and bugs. If you interpret a lot for dangerous situations, you may start getting fearful for your own safety or the safety of your loved ones. Even empathy can be a problem. It's a great personality trait in some ways for interpreters to have, because the more empathy you have, the easier it is to read other people's emotions, to get a lot of the contextual content from a call. And especially for remote interpreters, every little bit helps, every tone of voice, every pause that you can interpret, so to speak, the emotional undercurrents. But that same part of your personality that gives you so much help can really hurt you if you're interpreting for trauma survivors, because it can actually predispose you, if you're not careful, to vicarious trauma, especially if you're not controlling. You're just automatically being empathetic and not like a therapist who gets trained to control that empathy. That interpreters are not getting that training. It's just not happening. Especially, this is a tough one, as I said, with graphic or violent content or in any way distressing content, because you become the voice. Just using first person, there's a lot of research now on mirror neurons, and there's an increasing recognition that by interpreting in direct speech, you are actually feeling the pain and suffering more of the person that you're interpreting for. Never mind if it intertwines with your own past trauma or that sense of helplessness you get. You want to help people who are suffering, and yet you just have to stand back and be their voice. So the U.S. Office for Victim of Crimes has a whole vicarious trauma toolkit. You can see the website there, urge you to go there. There's a lot of great research that's gone on vicarious trauma. But ultimately, nobody's going to do this for you. The key to your well-being is in you. So this is where we look at what can you do, because this is truly in your hands. Don't wait for the language companies, as much as we urge them and talk to them too. And it starts with making a safe place with yourself, kind of setting boundaries around encounters. And we used to talk about safe place. We talk more about safe space now, because the idea is it doesn't have to be like visualizing a place, although a lot of people, including interpreters, love to visualize beaches and mountains and other safe or beautiful, peaceful places. But it could be like a piece of music that you love, or imagining the face of a loved one or a loved one hugging you. It could be a prayer, or some sort, even a hymn, some sort of piece of sacred music. Anything that mentally makes you feel safe is something to practice outside the encounter in case you need that resource during the call. Breathing is the single most important thing you can do. I struggle with this all the time, even in my daily life. Remembering to breathe, because what happens when we get stressed? Our breathing gets sharp and shallow and short, and it moves up from where it should be, especially for professional interpreters. It should be coming from way down in our diaphragm, and it moves up to our chest and then our throat. So it's bad for our voice too, by the way. And when we breathe deeply from the diaphragm, it helps us calm down, reground, just in every possible way. It's healthy for us in general, and for stress and trauma in particular, and yet we forget. So I don't want to put extra pressure on you here, but it's not a stress thing. If you can just do this one thing, remember to breathe deeply and regularly whenever you can, including, yes, literally while you're interpreting, taking those deeper breaths. It will help you interpret better in every way, voice and also accuracy, but also in terms of taking care of yourself. One simple thing to do ahead of time is just take 5 deep breaths in and out, and close your eyes for half a minute, assuming you feel safe to close your eyes. I know not everyone does. And look at your own body language. It's like I tend to get tension more in my shoulders, like my upper back of my shoulders. Where's your tension going? And do you feel it right now? And then just become kind of more grounded in your own body, and then take another 5 deep breaths. Another thing highly recommend is doing breathing exercises that are more formal regularly. Just Google them. There are millions. There are many dozens of different breathing exercises out there, and it doesn't really matter which ones you choose. What matters is finding the ones that work for you. Here's a common one that I like, and it doesn't work for everybody, but it's when you exhale through your mouth and close your mouth, and then inhale to a count, and the count varies, but one example is 4, hold for a count of 7, and then exhale for a count of 8. So you're always holding and exhaling for longer than you inhale. That's very effective for whom it is effective, people such as me. For some people, it can, and for physiological reasons I won't go into, it can make them a little more tense, or even have the opposite effect relating to trauma. So you kind of have to experiment, and you don't want to be experimenting. And I know that during a call, you wouldn't necessarily be doing the exercise, but if you do it just before the call, or if there is a pause during the call or between calls, unless you do it kind of at home, so that the exercise, whichever exercise or 2 you pick that seems to work for you, becomes really automatic, it will be very hard to call on when you need it. And by the way, there's tons of research showing that this affects your health and well-being and sleep and all kinds of other great things in every aspect of your life, so you can't really go wrong. Highly, that would be my number one thing. And finding ways, we'll talk more about this in a minute, to balance your professionalism and compassion, because what we find is a lot of interpreters are suffering from feeling that they're not doing enough to help, and yet they have to be professional, they have to be these black boxes. And so if one of the things that you can just tell yourself as a way of balancing professionalism and compassion is, I am their voice. I mean, I am giving this gift of voice. And if you're a trauma survivor, you know this to be true. To recover your voice is like the hugest thing. And to have someone be your voice when you can't is a powerful gift. This is a message you can give yourself as interpreters that could be relaxing. All right. Now, one of my favorite questions of all time, how is the interpreter like Spider-Man?
Guys, what do you think? Agile?
Absolutely, especially for remote.
Yeah.
Any other guesses?
You have to jump in a lot of the time.
Oh gosh, yes.
So again, you're agile, instant reflexes.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go in different directions as needed.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be brave. Somebody said we're language acrobats. I like that. Swoops in an unexpected times, multitasking, elasticity, flexibility. You have to have the same flexibility and superpower to adjust to situations and the context you are put in. You have to make things stick, like meaning. You're an unknown helper also. You're kind of a superhero without an identity. And you are untangling a web of languages. You have to be sharp. You shoot your own webs, your own safety nets. It's a good one.
All of these are fabulous answers, Carolyn, and each and every one of them is true. I love getting the answers to the question. I'm going to give you my personal answer, and that is the fact that Spider-Man has great power, and with great power comes, and we all in the United States, I think, know the answer to that one.
And that great responsibility.
So great power comes great responsibility. To others, yes, as interpreters, to be their voice, to respect it, and especially for trauma survivors, yes, but also yourself. And so what are the other concrete things you can do before, during, and after the assignment? For before, preparation, setting boundaries and briefing. During, grounding, breathing, relaxation, and visualization. And after the session, debriefing, social support, self-care plan. Let's look at each of these. And I just want to tell you, without getting into detail about what trauma-informed services are, that these are programs and services that are very survivor-centered, victim and survivor-centered, and that really recognize the impact on everyone, including themselves, all the service providers who work in this field. And that's what we want interpreters to be. Trauma-informed interpreters who recognize the impact in others and themselves and integrate that knowledge into everything they do. So the first thing is to plan in advance what you can do to take care of yourself, because you're not going to get too much information about the encounter. There's decades of research on system 1 versus system 2 thinking. System 1 is the here, now, on your feet, spontaneous and fast thinking. It's what we do as interpreters all the time, but it's not thinking that results in the best outcomes. The research is categorical on this. So if you plan ahead of time, how will I best manage an encounter that might be traumatic, even if I don't know it ahead of time, and you have strategies in place, you will be protecting yourself much more effectively than if you just try and do it on the fly. So keep this PowerPoint and pull it out. The other thing is, if you prep yourself and if you know you're going to get specific kinds of assignments, and you research the terminology for like you're going to be doing some banking and you never did that before, or you're going to be doing mental health, and The more you research both the setting and the terminology that might come up, the more solid you'll feel, the more confident and competent and professional you feel, the more you're protecting yourself against vicarious trauma. Physical objects are another thing we'll come to in a minute. Rituals and relaxation and briefing. What do we mean? And note-taking. Make sure you have note-taking materials unless you're sign language, and we'll show you why. So objects and rituals, if you just have little objects that you're attached to, and just as a way of setting boundaries, you actually put it into your pocket or your purse, or or wear it if it's like a necklace or something, and bring it into the session, and then take it out or take it off or put it away after you're interpreting for the day. It's one way of setting boundaries around the encounter. Some interpreters actually put an elastic band around their wrists, and if they're stressed, they snap the band, which actually grounds them. We'll explain grounding in a minute. But then you take it off after the set. There are other rituals. I mean, you could put on a scarf and make a ritual of taking it off. But you could also engage in a prayer if you're a religious or spiritual person before the encounter, and repeat it after the. And I keep saying encounter because I don't come from the world of remote interpreting, and what I'm really talking about here is a series of calls. But before and after you are done with that particular series of calls. Relaxation techniques are like breathing techniques. Go online and research. There's a million out there, but again, you have to try them out. Until you try them out, and you'll find very specific instructions online for how to do any of these. Progressive relaxation, meditation, mindfulness, aromatherapy, Tai Chi, biofeedback, all of this. You can do it, but will it really work effectively for you? You have to try them to find out. Now, grounding is something that therapists use, and they train trauma survivors to use as a technique to help them move away from the trauma into the here and now and the present, and you can too. So let's say you're sitting down for a call, and it's getting like really stressful, and maybe it's like a rape survivor, recounting for a therapist or a police officer or anybody on what actually happened, or never mind a child. You could become conscious of where you are in the room, like the feeling of sitting in a chair, the sound of, maybe you're at home and there's a breeze blowing through a window, or you feel the current of heat or air conditioning, using your 5 senses to remind yourself, I am so-and-so, the interpreter. I am here in my call center, cubicle, or my office, home office. These are examples of grounding. One therapist I know says, most people have toes. You can always wiggle your toes. It's amazingly simple and grounding. Again, during the call, to the extent that you can engage in deep breathing and maybe even a few moments between calls for relaxation exercises, any other special techniques, talk to other remote interpreters or any interpreters that what works for them. Find how do you manage stress or traumatic encounters. And again, coming back to, I shared earlier the story of my friend taking a break. Yeah, in principle, you can, but the pressure is on. You may have to call up the language service provider, or if you're in a call center, sit down with a supervisor and say, hey, here's what I'm experiencing. Do you have any recommendations regarding breaks? If you just leave it to them, they're not going to change their behavior or their beliefs about what you should be doing. Another thing that you cannot do if you do remote court interpreting, but that we want you to explore with your language company, because they may not condone it either, is switching from first to third person temporarily if you're really, really freaked out by some of the content you're dealing with, because that can help give you distance and ground yourself back in who you are, and you're not experiencing this as if it were happening to you, because that's what you don't want. If you're a spoken language interpreter, you can take notes. That can actually be a great technique to focus on something concrete and to ground you again away from the graphic content. Visualizing, which is a great thing to do for interpreting to help your accuracy, and many interpreters are trained to do it, is not what you want to do for graphic or distressing or traumatic content. How do you avoid it? There are some challenges in that, and different interpreters find different techniques. Like one is to imagine visualizing like a safe space that is an actual place, but that doesn't work for all interpreters, but try out, see if it works for you. Imagining what's happening as stick figures instead of seeing it act out with real people in your imagination. Find out what works for you so that you're not actually visualizing, if possible, the content that you're interpreting, if it's graphic or traumatic. We know that's, and let us know what you find that works for you. But visualizing instead some safe place, have an alternative in your mind, is again something you want to practice outside the calls, because it's not something you can do easily on the fly. I've already discussed about taking the breaks. You will have to explore your options and assert your needs, because again, nobody is going to do that for you. But consider the fact that you'll be a better interpreter for it, you'll be more accurate, you will be more on task, and that is not a small thing. And make your arguments in advance if you are advocating for taking more breaks or longer breaks than they might want you to be having, whichever company or companies you are working with. After the session, you definitely want to look at debriefing. We'll talk about that in a second. Immediate self-care wellness plans, which is long-term and support systems. And that starts with a determination that you are just going to do this, because interpreters, I've noticed we have a tendency to put ourselves last on the list, and we have to put ourselves first if we want to be able to keep giving to the profession. So a debrief is a follow-up conversation about the encounter with anyone professionally related to the encounter. And it can be a great opportunity to get and give feedback or get stressed out, and you can learn more. And there are language companies that actually sometimes do or routinely do this with their interpreters, but not necessarily after a traumatic call. It could just be like every 20 calls that, this is what they're doing, or something was brought to their attention. So what we're basically hearing when we suggest debriefing for remote interpreters is, yeah, right, you're dreaming in color, lady. So you're the ones who are going to have to advocate for yourselves. It's not likely to come from them that you're going to get a debrief just because you need one. Again, find out who is the person or people that you could debrief with, because you won't be able to debrief with the service provider, right? Who is that person who can help you? And it's probably somebody who works as staff at the agency, either professional counsel or someone who's been assigned the task of debriefing you, if you're lucky. But you will probably have to ask, unless it's a great company that has gone to some trouble. Then there is the after the session self-care piece. First of all, the big picture is take care of, we hear this all the time in general, take care of yourself. Sleep, we now know the research is categorical. Most of us need at least 7 hours, if not more. Good nutrition actually helps us interpret better, helps every aspect of our life. Moving for at least 30 minutes a day would be fantastic. And relaxation techniques. These are the larger picture of self-care. We all know them. It's a question of deciding to prioritize them, and that's not what always happens. Some interpreters find their own self-care, like not holding on to details, trying to debrief, letting the specifics go. Some interpreters find just having a good cry helps, or find if you have a team of interpreters, going to them rather than a counselor for the organization. Or some interpreters, maybe it's the introverts, they just want to withdraw and find a quiet space at home, or find friends to talk to. Find out what works for you, but again, plan ahead of time and write down your plan, because what happens is most interpreters don't, and this is what gets them in the end. We know that research shows you're much more likely to act on those plans if they come in the form of specific measurable objectives. And this is what a specific or SMART objective looks like. And we do trainings to train interpreters how to do this, and no one is actually doing this. So you'll have to do it yourself. And this is a PowerPoint you will get that will show you here examples of how you can do this. Be sure that it's realistic. If you don't think it's 70% or more likely to happen, it won't. So make sure that your objectives to take care of yourself are realistic. And for purposes of this PowerPoint that you'll get, I actually give you some specific examples of what does a SMART objective look like for before, during, or after a tough session. But at the end of the day, it's about you. And remember that oxygen mask principle. You put the oxygen mask on the plane that's having problems on yourself first before you try and help others with their oxygen mask. You need to take care of yourselves so that we can continue having you be wonderful professional interpreters, remote interpreters for many years to come. I am happy to take questions after if anyone would like to stay. I'm sorry I ran out of time. There was some great feedback during the call, but it's wonderful that you cared enough about yourselves and about what you do to attend, and I really wish you the best. And you can absolutely contact me with questions at any time. Carolyn knows where to find me. And in fact, I can add my contact information to the PowerPoint, and I will do that.
Great, thank you, Marjory. I am going to throw out one question because we have like a second. What about confidentiality? So privacy, when you're debriefing or talking to a friend about your cases, you know, how can we take into account HIPAA compliance, privacy there?
It's a wonderful question. It's an excellent question. And the answer is fortunately fairly simple and straightforward, including HIPAA, which for those of you who are not from the United States is our healthcare privacy law, our number one, I should say. We have others. And the concept is, first of all, you can always talk about your feelings. Like I interpreted, you know, for a woman today, and it hit me so hard. I was wanting to cry by the end, and you just can go on and on about your own feelings. There's nothing confidential about your feelings unless you choose to make them so. And often it's our feelings we need to get out. Now, to the extent that you need to tell some of the story in order for the person you're speaking to understand, it's the identifying details that you urgently need to avoid, not just for HIPAA, but for confidentiality in general. And those identifying details could be as simple in person-to-person interpreting as saying, you know, pregnant woman, because you live in a small language community in a small town, and everybody knows that there's only one person who's pregnant at that. But if you're a remote interpreter, you can probably say, you know, safely say a detail like, you know, a pregnant woman with impunity because you're interpreting for across the country or other countries. So it's that idea that there's nothing that you say about that person that anybody could guess who you're talking about is the most important thing, but give as few details as possible to get the feelings out of you. That's the important thing, is get the feelings out of you so that you can get comfort from your loved ones.
Yes, that makes sense. And I came across that in social work a lot as well. Wanting to confide in people close to you, but having to be very careful about not identifying anybody. Great. Well, just because of time, you know, we've had so many people thanking you for the presentation, myself included. Marjory, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been an incredible presentation, and we will be sending out the PowerPoint to all participants here, and the contact information for Marjory if anyone wants to follow up.
Thank you, everyone, for coming again, and I wish you the greatest good luck in everything you do and in all your self-care.
Thank you, Marjory. Talk to you soon.
Take care, everybody. Bye.